Alright, today we're going to be talking about classroom space arrangement in an early childhood classroom. And first of all, one of the questions that you should ask yourself when arranging a classroom is, what do I want my students to feel and how do I want them to behave in my classroom? The reason you want to ask this question is because everything in the classroom will contribute to the tone of the class. And from the furniture to the materials to the supplies you have in the classroom will contribute to the tone. So if you're asking that question, then you will be constantly thinking about how your space arrangement is influencing your students. Now you can see these two classrooms here. This one here has some good color right here on the walls, but other than that it's pretty blank. Everyone's facing forward, so you can see that they're all facing the teacher. This is more of a lecture style classroom. So think about how students would maybe behave in this classroom versus this classroom down here where you've got table groups. You've got anchor charts here to help support learning. Looks like there's an interactive whiteboard to get students participating in classroom discussions and activities. It's a much more engaging classroom, so students would most likely behave differently in this classroom than they would in the classroom above. Now, the children in the classroom will be inclined to act appropriately if the space is orderly and organized. So if you follow the old saying of a place for everything and everything in its place, then that will help avoid this here, all of this. Students just doing their own thing, using things that they maybe shouldn't. Basically avoid the chaos that could ensue if your classroom is not organized. Now, your space should be welcoming, pleasing to the eye, and safe, so you want to keep that in mind. You don't want things to be too cluttered. You don't want to have things too bright or too dark because those could contribute to a less welcoming classroom. To help make it welcoming for the students, they should have ownership in their space. So something that you could do would be to have their artwork displayed at their eye level. Because then as they come in, they see their own work and they feel comfortable in that space because they know that they're welcome there and that they're important because their work is on display. But this could also include things like having cubbies for each student or a desk for each student so that they feel like they have their own space in the classroom. Additionally, you want to make sure the space is inclusive for all students, meaning that you want to make sure it's multicultural, non-sexist, children with different abilities are welcomed in the classroom, and you would achieve this through including books, pictures, and learning materials that would appeal to all ethnicities, all abilities. You can see here in this classroom that we have a student here in a wheelchair. We have students of different ethnicities. There's pictures of the students back here. When including pictures in the classroom, you want to make sure they're multicultural. You can also even see here in the teachers, we've got different ethnicities of teachers. It's not a requirement, but it does help sometimes to have teachers who have differing perspectives and backgrounds to contribute to the learning of the students. And then here in the books, it's hard to see, but you would want to have a variety of books about different cultures and have main characters of differing genders and ethnicities and backgrounds as well. Excuse me. You also want to make sure that your containers are labeled. And the shelves that the containers are on should be child size so that they're easy for the children to access. Now, this picture here just has words on the labels. You can see here scissors, markers, rulers. Okay, what would make this better would be including pictures, because this supports students, especially younger students who aren't reading yet, that they can still go and get the supplies that they need, but it'll also help encourage language skills as they associate pictures and the physical materials with the pictures. Now, you want to make sure that the centers in your classroom are well defined, that they don't just all run together. You also want to provide space for students that is quiet and calming, where they can be alone if they need it, because sometimes school can be a little overwhelming, or they might have a sensory disorder where they need some time away, and so you want to provide that for your students. In this classroom, you can see the shelves are arranged to separate this area from this area. There's rugs. That also helps define areas. So there's different things that you can do to help define the different learning centers. Now, the space arrangement in the classroom is kind of divided into 4 main categories that you need to know. So the way that I like to visualize this is dividing it into quadrants. This isn't necessarily how the classroom would be divided, but it helps me to visualize how these things might relate together. So first of all, we have wet. So these are things that might be like visual arts that you're going to need for, like, water to wash your paintbrushes. It can also be your science area, sensory, again, areas where you might need water or where water or paint might get spilt. So you want that to be an easy area to clean up. Then opposite of that, you have dry, where you would not have messy things. This might be like your reading area where you're not going to want water or liquids to spill on those materials, or things that are activities that are on a carpeted area. And then you also have active, where these are more like your dramatic play and blocks where kids are moving. They might be a little bit louder. So you want to have a good open space for that and have it well arranged so that kids are safe in those areas. And then in the other quadrant you have quiet, where children can go to be by themselves or be just simply quiet. These are things more like your reading areas. It could even include things like math or English language arts, where you don't include a lot of movement unless you're doing an activity where they're actually like moving from like letter to letter or number to number or things like that. So if they're doing more of a sorting activity that's just quiet at the table, this would be in this quadrant. Now these can kind of cross over. Active and wet kind of tend to go together because say your sensory table, kids are going to be really actively digging or playing in that table, whereas dry tends to be a little bit more quiet, but not always. But they can cross over, so do recognize that. It's not like a wet area is just wet and you hardly do any activities there. It's just there's crossover here that you just need to be aware of, so when you're planning, you know where you're in the room you're going to be doing your activities based on if it's wet, dry, active, or quiet. Also, something to keep in mind is you might not want these right next to each other. So for example, active you might not want right next to quiet, because if you have a child quietly trying to read a book and then right next to that you have a very active gross motor activity, it could be really distracting for those students in the quiet area. Now it's really hard to separate it completely because it's all in the same room, but if you use some things like we have back over here, these shelves here. Okay, that can help to separate areas so that you have a little bit more division between these space arrangement areas.